In this video, we're going to have a look at the overview of the Bible. Now, I think it's very important to have an overview of the Bible because not having an overview of the Bible is one of the reasons why many Christians struggle to read the entire Bible. Because when they read the Bible, they feel a little bit lost. They don't know how to navigate their way through the Bible because they don't have an overview of the Bible. Now, there are many other reasons why many Christians struggle to read the entire Bible. The Bible is a very thick book. You can feel overwhelmed by it. You read the Old Testament and you get to the sacrificial system and it doesn't make sense to you, or the genealogies. Now, there are many reasons why people quit reading the entire Bible. But if you have an overview of the Bible, it will help you to navigate your way through the Bible. Now, on page 9, I have a schematic presentation of the overview of the Bible. Now, the first 9 blocks represent the Old Testament, and it is a growing line because the Old Testament builds up to block 10, which is the New Testament. So it builds up to a climax, because you will see that block 10 is not a growing line, because Jesus Christ in the New Testament is actually the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Now, there's a beautiful verse that can help us to better understand this. And this is in Colossians 2, verse 17. It says, "These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ." So this passage says it very well, that the Old Testament is like a shadow and it's pointing towards the person of Jesus Christ. That is why block 10 is not a rising line, because block 10 is the fulfillment, is the climax of the Bible. And the Old Testament is this shadow building up towards the climax and pointing towards Jesus. Now let us focus on each of these 10 major blocks of the Bible. Our first block is prehistory, and the reason why it's prehistory because it bears no date. So the events described for us in the prehistory part of the Bible, which is Genesis 1 through to chapter 11, are called prehistory because the events described there bear no date. And there are 4 major events there. The first one is creation. We know it happened, but we cannot date it. The second one is the fall of humanity. During creation, God created everything good, and then the mysterious thing happened that humanity transgressed against God, and that's the second one, the fall of humanity. And then the third one is the flood, and the fourth one is the Tower of Babel. But what is so amazing when we read the first part of the Bible, that God revealed His heart in Genesis 6 for us in a vulnerable way. It says in Genesis 6 verse 6 that God regretted that He made humanity, and His heart was grieved because He was disappointed. How could they do that? And then Genesis 6 verse 7, God said, you know what? I'm going to wipe them from the face of the earth. And then in verse 8, God changed His mind. He said, but God found favor in Noah. Because in verse 9 it says Noah was a righteous person. He was a good person. So God decided, you know what? I'm not going to wipe them all from the face of the earth. So He called Noah to build the ark. And following that episode, He made a covenant with Noah that he will never destroy this world with water again. Then God continued to take a risk, and that takes us to the second block, which is patriarchs and slavery. And that block tells us that God continued to take the risk by building a new family of believers. So the entire Bible is actually the story of God building a new family of believers. And God did it in such a way that it didn't happen on a natural way, but it happened because of God's direct intervention. Why do we say that? Well, there are 2 reasons basically. First, He chooses an old, sterile woman, Sarah, to become the mother of this new community of believers. Now, she was the wife of Abram, and she was sterile. So it was God's direct intervention, and she was old as well. Then the second reason, that God called Abram, and he was from the heathens, to become the father of this new community. When you read Joshua 24 verses 2 and 3, it says that Abram did not know God when God called him. He was actually a heathen. He didn't know God. So this formation of this new community was not the result of human thought and of human effort. It was God's direct intervention. God took the initiative because God said, you know what? I want to risk again. I will not wipe you from the face of the earth. And I will ask you, Abram, to form a new community so that you can become a blessing to the nations. And then this second block, patriarchs and slavery, ends in Genesis 50 with Joseph. And then Joseph and his ancestors lived in Egypt for 430 years. And during those days, they became slaves in Egypt. And then the next block takes us to Egypt, and that is the time of the Exodus and the conquest. So as I've said, Genesis ends with Joseph and his family in Egypt, and then Exodus picks up the story 430 years later. So the time difference between the last book of Genesis and the first book of Exodus is 430 years. Because when you read the first book of Exodus, it says there is a new Pharaoh and he didn't know about Joseph because it's 430 years later. And now they are slaves working 7 days a week. But God remembered his covenant he made to Abram. That was about 1800 years before Christ. So God remembered that. And God decided, I'm going to call someone to take my people out of Egypt into the promised land to conquer it. And God actually picked an unlikely hero. And we know it was Moses. But why was he the unlikely hero? I must admit, if I would have lived those days and I needed to pick someone, I would probably not pick Moses. But God knows better. So why do we say he's the unlikely hero? There are many reasons. The first one, he was raised in Pharaoh's palace. And he was not part of the Jewish culture. He was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. And number two, he was then considered to be part of the enemy camp. Number three, he murdered an Egyptian. And then number four, he needed to run for his life for about 40 years. So he became a murderer and then a wanderer for 40 years. And then number five, he was very old when God called him to lead his people out of Egypt. And then number six, he had a speech impediment. He complained when God called him. He said, God, but I cannot speak well. How can you expect me to lead the people out of Egypt? But God said, no, I'm going to use you. And this is the pattern in the Bible, that God always picks an unlikely hero because God wants to get the honor. It's not about us. It's about God's direct intervention to fulfill this covenant he made to Abram. And then Moses took them out of Egypt, and then they entered the promised land, and then they conquered the promised land. They wandered for about 40 years in the desert. And that brings us to our next block. It is number 4. So as they entered the promised land, they did not have a king. They were ruled by judges. Now that was the period before they got kings. It was the time frame of the judges. The tribes were not closely united because they traveled in the promised land. It was a new time for them. So it was a little bit of chaotic. That's why God had sent judges to rule them and to create better order in that society. Now, the wonderful book of Ruth, the story of Ruth and Naomi, it also happened during this time frame. Now, there are many judges, but two of the well-known judges are Gideon and Samson. We all know about Samson, the strong guy. But what we do need to know during this period, it was a very dark time in the history of Israel because they didn't follow the 10 commandments. So when you read the book of Judges, you recognize a very distinct pattern in the book of Judges. And this pattern is where they, number one, sin, and then number two, they will show remorse, and then God will pardon them. So they will sin, show remorse, and be pardoned. So that is the pattern that continues to occur in the book of Judges. So it was a very dark time. And this dark time takes us to the next block, which is the United Kingdom. Now, the dark time of the Judges paved the way for this period because the people realized it's dark. Everyone was just doing what they want. They want to have a king like all the other nations. So they went to the priest Samuel and asked him to appoint and to anoint a king. And Samuel said, no, you have God as your king. And you can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 5 and 20. Samuel said no. Samuel wanted to resist and said no to request, but they insisted. And then Samuel said, okay, if you want to have a king, then I will appoint a king. And then the first king that was appointed was Saul. The second one was David. That was about 1,000 years before Christ when David became the king. Now, when we think about David, it conjures up images of a shepherd, a soldier, but also someone who wrote beautiful poetry for us, many psalms. Then the next king is Solomon, and Solomon was known to build that beautiful temple. Now, that was the time when they were very united under the three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And that takes us to our next block, number 6, and that is the time of the divided kingdom. So the united kingdom of the previous block did not remain united. They actually divided, and that was very unfortunate. And the big culprit was Solomon. And we read about that in 1 Kings 11 verse 9. It says, "The Lord was very angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice." Solomon accumulated a lot of wealth. He married women from foreign countries and he started to worship their gods as well. So he turned away from the Lord, and it really grieved the Lord. And then Solomon continued to tax the 10 northern tribes way more than the 2 southern tribes. So he treated the southern tribes better than the northern tribes. And that was very unfortunate. And then they came to see him, they complained, and Solomon continued to raise the taxes. So in 925, the 10 northern tribes decided, you know what, we are going to move away, we're going to break away. So the kingdom divided in 925 before Christ. Now the northern kingdom retained the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes, retained the name Judah. So it's Israel, 10 northern tribes, and the 2 southern tribes were called Judah. Now it was because of Solomon's disobedience that the kingdom actually divided in 2. And still part of the divided kingdom, something very unfortunate happened. And that happened because of the Assyrian Empire, who was very cruel and relentless in war. Now in 722, they actually entered and conquered the 10 northern tribes' territory, and they took them into exile, the 10 northern tribes, and they never returned back to that part of the world. Interesting also is to notice that they didn't take away all the people who lived there. They took most of the people, but there were some people who stayed behind. And then the Assyrians brought from their own people to live there in the northern kingdom. And this mixed race of Assyrians and people from the 10 northern tribes who intermarried. That new race that was formed was the Samaritans. It was a mixed race of Assyrians and Israelites. And when you get to the New Testament, you realize that is why the Jewish-speaking people did not like the Samaritans, because they were kind of half Jews. So in 722, the Assyrians, the world power of that time, took them into exile and they never returned. Then in 586, you see the end of the southern kingdom. Now, Assyrian kingdom suddenly collapsed in 622 BC when Babylon became the new world power. So Babylon conquered Assyria and they became the new world power. Now, unfortunately, the people's persistent sin, despite all the warnings by the prophets, had caused the Lord to allow Jerusalem to be conquered by the Babylonians. So in 586, the unthinkable happened. And what was the unthinkable? The unthinkable is that Jerusalem would be destroyed, as well as the temple. It was unthinkable. Why? Because they believed God lives there, and if God lives there, no one can touch it. It can never be destroyed. But the unthinkable happened. The Babylonians came in 586 and they completely destroyed the people and took them into exile. And that brings us to our seventh block, the time in exile. Now, there are two major people during that time. It's Ezekiel and Daniel. They were prophets in exile. Very important to know, since they are away from Jerusalem, where it was all about bringing the sacrifices to the temple. They don't have the temple anymore, so their way of worship changed in exile. It was more now about prayer, confession, and teaching became the main focus, not the sacrifices anymore, because they don't have the temple anymore. So they were in exile. It was about teaching, confession, and prayer. And then Babylon was taken over by the Persian Empire. In 549, Cyrus the Great formed the Persian Empire, and they became the dominant force during the time when they were in exile. And the Persian Empire encourages the people to return. And we know the story of Esther also happened during this time, where she convinced the king to let her people go back and to rebuild Jerusalem. So the empire, the Persian Empire, encourages people to return. Now, the return of the people in exile didn't happen just in one day. It took place over a very long period. Now, there were three main groups who did return back to Jerusalem. Now, the first main group returned about 536 BC to rebuild the temple. Then the second group in 548 under Ezra, he was the scribe. And then in 444 BC, Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer, returned with another group. Now, it's interesting to know that they were called Jews for the first time when they returned to rebuild Jerusalem. So the exiles who returned were called Jews for the first time. Now, this word derives from the Hebrew word Yehudi, which is related to the word Judah. So we see that God remained faithful to his promise he made to Abraham. It took centuries, but God never turned his back on his people. So that brings us to our next block, which is the silent years. That's block number 9. Now, we need to ask the question, where does the Old Testament end? Now, the Old Testament ends with Persia as the world power and the people returning back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. This is where the Old Testament ends. And where does the New Testament begin? Now, the New Testament begins with a dramatic new scene. The world is completely different. It's not Persia who is the world power. It is Rome who's controlling the world. And there's a brand new language. Everything is so new. And we call this period the silent years. Now, why do we call this period the silent years? We call it the silent years because there are no prophets, no miracles, and no angel visitation. So where the Old Testament ends and where the New Testament begins, you have a 400-year time frame. And we call that the silent years. So the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament is 400 years. We call it silent, no prophecy, no miracles, and no angel visitation. Now the question is, what happened during those 400 years? Well, one can use the example of a concert. When you go to a concert, halfway through the concert, the curtains will close, and then you will just hear a shuffle as decor shifts happen. And then the curtain will open again, and then you see a brand new scene. And this is what actually happened during the 400 years. We had many decor shifts. It is as if God was changing the world's scenery. And when Jesus was born, the gospel could spread so fast because God made many decor shifts during the 400 silent years. So there are major decor shifts that happen. I have 5 there. Number 1 is political shifts. Number 2, cultural shifts. Number 3, geographical shifts. Then religious shifts. And number 5, language shifts. So let us focus on the first one, which is the political shifts. Now we see during these 400 years, the world power shifted from the east, Persia, to the west, with Alexander the Great, who conquered the world. He was very young and he died very young. He was a great general. And after his death, his empire was divided among his 4 generals. And those 4 generals continue to spread the dream of Alexander to make Greek the dominant culture so that there can be Greek thinking and that the Greek language could be everywhere. So they continued to follow and to spread his dream. Then in 63 before Christ, the Roman Empire became the dominant empire. So it was first Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, and followed with the Roman Empire in 63 BC. Now, the next world rulers, which is the Roman Empire, they fully embraced the Greek culture because it was so dominant, it was so powerful. Rome spoke Latin, but the rest of the Roman Empire spoke Koine Greek, which means general Greek. The New Testament was written during the 1st century AD, and because Greek was the main language, it was written in Greek. Now, part of the cultural shifts is also that during this time frame between the Old and the New Testament, the 400 years, there were probably more Jews living in Alexandria than in Jerusalem. So we see the culture has changed from the Persian Empire to this dominant Greek culture where everyone started to speak Greek language. Number 3, we see some geographical shifts. Now, during the time of the New Testament, there were probably more Jews in Alexandria, as I've said, than Jerusalem. There were many Jews living in Alexandria. And Alexandria, which is in Egypt, was named after Alexander the Great. We just see the huge impact that Alexander the Great and his generals had during those days. Now, during the Roman domination, they have divided Palestine in 3 areas. North, you will have Galilee, then Samaria, and then in the south, you will have Judea. Now, before that, you only had Samaria in the north and Judea in the south. But Rome divided that area in Palestine in those 3 areas. And that takes us to the next shift, which is the religious shift. Now, as I've said, the Greek culture was strong. People started to speak Greek all over that part of the world. The Greek culture was the dominant culture, and the Jewish people started to resist this adoption of Greek culture and language. They didn't want to follow that pattern like all the other nations did. They resisted it. They didn't want the Greek culture to be the dominant culture and to see that their culture would be influenced. And that is why they have formed some parties, some groups to resist this new formation of a new culture. And there are some Jewish groups, we all know about them, but they were formed during the 400 silent years. The first one is the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were known for their legalism, to be rigid, and Jesus clashed a lot with them because the letter of the law was more important to them than the spirit of the law. For Jesus, it was about love. For them, it was about the rigid following and adherence to the law. Then the second group is the Sadducees. They were a smaller group than the Pharisees, and they were politically more active. They were in favor of the rule of the Roman Empire because they believed they brought peace to the world. Then you have the scribes, but strictly speaking, the scribes were not a party, but a group of laymen who loved to study the law. Then our fourth group is the Zealots. They were followers of the Pharisees, but they were more activists. They didn't like the Roman rule, and they want to get rid of the Roman rule in the area of Palestine. Those people were called the Zealots. So you see, during the 400 silent years, there were different Jewish parties formed to resist this influence of Greek culture and Greek language. Now we are going to focus on the next shift, which is the language shifts. Now, the language of the inhabitants of Palestine changed from Hebrew to Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was a dialect of Hebrew. It's almost the same as Hebrew, but it was a dialect of Hebrew. And the Old Testament mainly was written in Hebrew. But after the formation of the Old Testament, the language changed from Hebrew in Palestine to Aramaic. Jesus also spoke Aramaic, that dialect of Hebrew. Now, during the time of Jesus, the priests and the rabbis only used Hebrew for religious matters. Latin was spoken in Rome, but Koine Greek was spoken in the rest of the Roman Empire. Now we see that all these shifts happen, all these decor shifts happen during the silent years. Silent because no angel visitation, no miracles, no prophecy. And then we go to our next block, which is block number 10, the New Testament. Now the New Testament happens when God ended this silent years, the curtain opened, and the silence was broken with the birth of Jesus Christ. The silence was broken with the cry of baby Jesus. And when the curtain opened, God has prepared the world scene in such a way that the gospel could spread so fast. And there are many reasons, but I want to give you 3 reasons why these decor shifts helped for the gospel to spread so fast. There was now a world language, and it was Greek, Koine Greek. Everyone could speak Greek. It was easy to travel, number 2, and there were Jewish settlements and synagogues all over the place. So God prepared the world scene in such a way for the rapid spread of the gospel. Now the New Testament is comprised of 27 books, and they can be grouped in the following way. Now the first 4 books we call the Gospels because it's the good news. It is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we have the book of Acts. Acts tells us about the formation of the church, the birth of the church. It is about the history of the church, the book of Acts. And then you get the letters of Paul and the other letters that Paul did not write. He wrote many of the letters of the New Testament, but the letters that he did not write, we call the general letters. And then the very last book of the Bible is Revelation. It is all about John's visions, all the images that he saw, to tell us that we are not heading towards an hopeless end, but we are heading towards an endless hope. I trust that this overview of the Bible was helpful. Now, when you read the book of Ruth, you realize that you're in the time frame of the Judges. That's block number 4. It was in the time before the kingdom, and it was a dark time in the history of Israel. When you read about David, 1 King Samuel, then you know it's in the time frame of the United Kingdom, which is block number 5. When you read about Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you read those books, you realize it's block number 10. We are in the New Testament. We are looking back and we realize the Old Testament is the shadow. We have the silent years where God prepared the world scene in a beautiful way for the rapid spread of the gospel, to show us that God has been faithful to his promise he made to Abram. We can trust God, and this new formation of the family in the New Testament we call the church. And that is a beautiful metaphor of the church, that we are a family. That is why we can call one another brother and sister, because we have God as our Father. And when Jesus taught us to pray, he said, "Our Father," because we are a family. I trust that it will motivate you to continue to read the Bible.